I think we were born in the wrong place and time and with much less talent.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of 1001 Album Complaints. This is the podcast where lifelong friends, musicians, and people who could complain about a free meal get together to talk about albums from Robert Dimery's list of 1001 albums you must hear before you die. We are going to give some deep dives on the background of the artist leading up to the recording, talk about individual tracks. So if you're not super familiar with the album, we're going to give you enough context so that you'll know what we're talking about. At the end, we're going to vote and tell you whether or not you really do need to hear this album before you die. And if the title of this show did not clue you in, as a fair warning to all listeners, we are going to complain about this band, about this album. We're going to make fun of this album. Now, we're all musicians ourselves. We know how hard it is to participate in any artistic endeavor, but we also understand there's a lot to nitpick and a lot to make fun of. So you have been warned and you are along for the ride. Now, today we are talking about an album that was released, ironically, in 1984. This is, of course, the album 1984 by the band Van Halen, released January 9th, 1984 from Warner Brothers Records. Now, to give you an idea of what we have been listening to this week, I'm going to play a quick snippet of not the opening track, but maybe the first real song on the album. This is the song Jump. We have all got our levels set here. I am going to throw it around the room to our cast of complainers, and they are going to introduce themselves by way of a particularly mean tweet-length review. And I'm going to throw it first to Alan.
Thanks, Tom. I know the marketing team didn't pull an all-nighter coming up with the album title on this one, but honestly, they could have just called this The Van Halen Brothers Valiantly Shred Their Way Through a Barrage of Horny Lyrics and Barroom Rock Filler. At least they would have saved themselves a few minutes.
I don't know if it's quite as pithy of a title as 1984.
Well, I got to counteract the runtime on this album a little bit.
All right. And next, I'm going to throw it over to our very special guest. I'm going to give her a proper introduction in just a moment. But first, let's hear your mean tweet length review, M.
In no universe should Top Jimmy be after Panama.
I don't know why Top Jimmy's there at all. All right. Excellent. Let's hear next from Phil.
America's response to Led Zeppelin. California's response to ZZ Top. Oversexed bro culture's response to Little Richard. Van Halen's 1984 is a commercial for an America that Reagan couldn't deliver, Bill and Ted couldn't manifest. Quite frankly, nobody wanted anyway.
Oh, that's good.
Still responding to Little Richard like 40 years later.
All right. And we're going to throw it next over to Rob.
Thanks, Tom. Here's my tweet length review. Like ZZ Top, except instead of long beards, these faces are obscured by mountains of cocaine. And instead of claiming Texas, Van Halen's hometown is just Spring Break, America.
Oh.
Well, we said it many times on the show, which is one of the reasons why we have guests, is because we're all basically the same person and our brains operate in the same way. So my tweet length review, this is Tom, by the way, and my tweet length review is probably inspired by ZZ Top's Eliminator. Van Halen takes their rocking, unique guitar-forward sound out back and beats it to death with a synthesizer. After my 30th time listening to this album this week, I was looking longingly out my front window at the Golden Gate Bridge and seriously contemplating their advice to go ahead and jump.
Jeez, wow. Rough.
Wow.
All right. Now, before we get into our general impressions of this album, I want to give a special welcome to our guest this week. This is M. Greiner. Now, she is way too accomplished to be talking to us. She has collaborated with David Bowie. She helped make the first music video in space and has appeared on albums by Def Leppard, Rob Zombie, and lots of others. M, take it away. Thank you for coming on our show, first of all, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. It's great to be with all of you. You've said it all, really. The product of having older brothers means that you end up on things like Rob Zombie records and Def Leppard records. There's a lot of music bouncing around in my home. In Canada, when we were growing up, there were some unfortunate phases where my brother listened to Dokken nonstop. But yeah, it's just really great to be with all of you. And I try to be positive because I'm into all of that. But you guys seem to make complaining, you're very like positive about your negativity.
Wow, high praise.
I like that.
Yeah, thank you. I've always said when Rob and I will go on long car rides together, we don't want to listen to good music. We want to listen to bad music so that we can talk about it and make fun of it. That's the best kind of experience.
Totally. And the 80s are just so great for that, right?
Oh, yeah. And speaking of the 80s,
I just want to let the record show that I defended Def Leppard on a recent episode, and I just want that to permeate the air on this one.
That's okay. No, I've heard it all.
so let's start talking about 1984. And I'm very curious to hear everyone's general impressions. I honestly don't know what you guys would really think about this. And Em, I want to go first to you. Do you have a history with this album? Like, what did you think of it?
I've never been a huge Van Halen fan, although I have nothing but respect for Eddie Van Halen. I'm not going to be saying anything negative about Eddie on this podcast. But just as a young kid, a young girl growing up in Canada, David Lee Roth was a flavor that sort of an introduction to a whole new breed of human. So, I mean, I love I'll Wait, which is sort of like this minor key song on this record. And that probably tells you what I kind of love. So yeah, Van Halen, not my first choice for favorite band, but really excited to hear what all of you are about to say.
You're showing your true colors there by picking the one song that Michael McDonald had to hand in and saying that's your favorite song on the album.
Yeah, was that guy just hanging out at studios back in the day, just waiting for someone to pull him off the couch to collaborate?
Dude, he was first on everyone's call list. That's yeah.
He's the hit maker.
Listen, I want to roll back my snarky tweet right away. This is an amazing rock record. The composition, the arrangements, the tone, the singing, the playing, they are all top notch. I did not grow up caring about bands like this or being a Van Halen fan. I have heard this record before, so I was mostly pleasantly surprised. I think most of the songs, even the non-hits, hold up pretty well and are just synonymous, as I believe Van Halen is synonymous, with a good time.
Interesting. I did not quite come to that conclusion. I feel like my mind on them was not changed one way or the other. I had never really gone through this album front to back, obviously knew the hits on this album, and by and large, I didn't really know much beyond the hits. And going back through this, I think the hits were still great, but I thought the filler was kind of just that, and I didn't think this did much to really add to my appreciation of the band, so for better or worse. So curious to see how this one kind of plays out.
I was really taken aback by the reality that like Van Halen is a band named after the guitar virtuoso or the brothers, right? And David Lee Roth still seems to think like, I'm the show. He has this ego that's like so insane and fun, and it did give me Little Richard vibes. But also he's gross. And like,
I'm not sticking up for him as a human, but he is so good as the front of this band.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm just talking about the persona on the record that you hear. I'm not getting into David Lee Roth's personal life. Yeah, he's just so wild.
He's got charisma.
Sounding
1,000,000%.
He was the perfect frontman for this project, and certainly for this era of their work, without a doubt.
Totally agree. And I think what I'm really reacting to, by far, Eddie Van Halen is the strongest member of the band. And when I listened to the material that I had not listened to a whole bunch, the non-hits, I was re-impressed by what a freaking conjurer, what a straight up wizard he is on that guitar. I do not understand. It still sounds fresh and exciting. I don't get tired of almost anything he's playing at any point in the album.
Listen, he's clearly a virtuoso, and he clearly influenced an entire generation of guitar players after him. I don't think guitars sounded the same once Eddie Van Halen hit the scene, and you cannot take that away.
Definitely not.
I had a little bit of a different experience than you did, though, Rob, is that I thought that the hits were fantastic, and I thought that the gulf between the hits and the rest of the songs was kind of pronounced. Now, that is not because Eddie is doing something worse on those songs. It just felt like the hits gelled in a way that some of the other filler material didn't really gel. And I think that that's where you really get the different visions for the band that David Lee Roth had versus what Eddie Van Halen had. And this project, as we will get into, represents the breaking point of those two artistic visions not really intersecting anymore.
Can I just say, yes, he's influential as a guitar player. He is, I think, the most influential guitar player, bar Jimi Hendrix. And his technique is objectively far beyond Jimi Hendrix. But in terms of reinventing what the instrument can even do, I think he is still super relevant to guitar players today. They are a group of two, in my opinion.
This definitely reaffirmed my admiration for Eddie Van Halen, and I don't want to just glaze him like this entire time, but everything you said is 100% true. I came away with that opinion unscathed, but I had a renewed respect for Alex, the drummer, in a way that, I remember growing up and not really paying attention to these kinds of things and feeling like, why would they just name the band after one guy? Come to find out, his brother's also in the band and is also a fucking killer drummer. And it's definitely a two-person show musically, but I do think the Roth element is such a wild card. Then you get the bass player who, I don't know if you're going to get into this, but they really tried to shake that guy down at every turn. Rightfully so, possibly, but curious how.
My note is that he is extremely replaceable in most of these songs, and it's not his fault.
He must be a cool dude.
I would disagree with
must
that.
be a chill hang.
I just, as a bass player, there's something about, to me, when you listen to some of these songs, Alex and Eddie are making music that only brothers can make, I feel like. And then you've got to somehow slot yourself in there, not take over. You're not going to be Pino Palladino or whatever. I don't know. I think he holds it down really well. And I think I couldn't really imagine someone else being the bass player in this band.
You know what? I will agree with that sentiment that there is not room for another virtuoso. They apparently at one point were in talks with like Billy Sheehan to come in and play. And I'm like, where would he have played? Like, what would he have done? He would have been so bored.
He'd been fired right away.
Yeah, he couldn't slide into that pocket. There's too many chops there. Yeah, I agree. I think he plays his part really well and he fits the band. I just thought that it seemed like in some of the reading that I did, they really wanted him to decrease his stake in the profits of the band. And
I thought you're going to say volume decreases.
Well, that's what every band wants all the time.
Well, it is really interesting that if you look at all of these songs on their first albums, they all say written by every member of Van Halen. All the songs are shared equal writing credit. Even on an album like this, where Eddie Van Halen wrote almost everything, David Lee Roth wrote the lyrics and a lot of the melodies, but Eddie Van Halen was writing everything and Michael Anthony was getting equal parts in the take for that. So that's a choice that they made, and I can see them maybe being annoyed by that choice. And it's probably kind of hard to go back on that after you've already had 3 or 4 albums that's like that, but I can understand where they're coming from when they say, hey, maybe if you just came in on an almost finished track and threw in a bass line that I wrote for you, you shouldn't get equal writing credit as I do.
Well, maybe, and as they started to see that the band was, I'm sure they knew they were going to replace David Lee Roth at some point soon, but at that point they were probably thinking like, how much mileage do we have left in this project? I want to get what I can get. But yeah, I think he was the right bassist for the time, but definitely not the most muscular player of the band, for sure.
Just to center on what y'all said about how there's no more room for a virtuoso, and to say one more nice thing about Eddie, he's ranging all over the pitch. Like, he's playing every position. He makes the thing sound like so many different things.
He's so sick. Honestly, I was at many times taken aback at what a fucking epic rhythm guitar player he is.
That's
just
what I'm
like
saying.
just fucking crushing. Yeah, totally. Absolutely. It's like 3-dimensional at times.
Such taste with the rhythm, great tone, and he can make it sound like a car's engine revving. He can make it sound. He's just so all over the place that it really does sound like a symphony.
Yeah. The thing I was really like, let's just do the whole like Eddie Van Halen thing now, right? Like I was most impressed with the way like he knew all the licks. Like he had all the Jimmy Page licks and the Jimi Hendrix licks and the Stevie Ray Vaughan licks and like Jeff Beck and Larry Carlton, ZZ Top. It's all in there. But it's like synthesized in an actual way. Like he actually brought them in and stirred them up and cooked them up himself and spit them back out as their own thing. He's not just...
It's composed.
Yeah,
it's not feel-based.
Totally. Like he actually ingested it as like a language and now spits it back out. And it's totally insane.
Absolutely. Because I think in a very real way, this is the beginning of technique-based guitar playing.
Sure.
Hendrix, Page, Clapton, they're all feel-based. They're really good with feel, but they do not have a depth of technique that this guy brings to the table. And that's why I think every guitar player since then that is trying to be a so-called shredder, they go to this playbook.
But in a different way, he has a ton of feel still, like a ton.
We mentioned ZZ Top 3 times already. I just want to say.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Of course.
I'm also sad that in that list and litany of guitar players, Phil, that Billy Gibbons is the only one that didn't get his name called out. He deserves that.
Yeah, that's unfair. That is.
I mean, Jimi Hendrix's favorite guitar player.
That is fair. His name isn't ZZ Top. His name is Billy Gibbons. Notice who I didn't mention though.
Oh yes. Well, he'll come up in the story. One of the things that they talked about early on when they were playing a lot of cover music, Eddie Van Halen would get annoyed because he would say that it doesn't sound like that band. It sounds like Van Halen. And we're trying to do covers of Cream songs and stuff like that. And we just sound like Van Halen. And then he kind of realized later that that's actually a positive thing, that you're not just doing these like pitch perfect renditions. You're doing your kind of own versions of them. Before we get into the background on Van Halen, I want to call out two things that I think are very tasteful in the arrangements. And I didn't fact check this on every song, but I'm pretty sure they do that thing that Guns N' Roses, we talked about them doing, where when it goes into a solo, they'll change the key. And so it really punctuates that the solo is coming in. And it's just this very smart technique to have it be like, oh, something different is happening now.
Absolutely. Or if it's not a key change, it's certainly a feel change. They do not shy away from writing a new section for the solo.
Yes. The other thing that I think that they did, that the solo sort of key change or feel change works really well when you have a ripping guitar player who's doing fantastic solos. But just from like a baseline musical construction level, they almost always do these like weird choppy rhythms in the pre-chorus. And then it's so smart because it just like gives you this kind of pause, and then it allows the chorus to just land really hard when it kicks back in. And I was really appreciating that throughout the week. And I was like, first of all, I'm definitely going to steal that and try to use that technique myself. But it's just kind of this smart way to make it feel like it doesn't just kind of all flow together.
Yeah, that is an interesting observation. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Like I'm immediately thinking of like Hot for Teacher and how that riff is so sort of like lopsided rhythmically, and it allows the chorus to just sort of explode in a very basic like pumping four on the floor. Well, not four on the floor, but you know what I mean.
This is what I was re-impressed by, even by the songs that I knew, is the composition is just very strong, I think, and I ascribe that to Eddie. I'm assuming.
Well, I think that some of the choices on the songs work okay. Some of the filler songs, though, to me, don't seem like they're well composed at all. Like, it doesn't seem like I think the tricks they use and like the tactics within the songs are smart, and they're salvaging what are not great ideas, again, outside of maybe like the top half of the record. That was kind of my biggest and real only complaint, was I did feel like some of the filler material sounded to me, other than the shred, a bit indistinguishable from what you might hear at just a bar down the street, frankly. And that's probably my biggest complaint, is the songcraft a little bit.
Yeah, that's fair. But for a 9-song album that's really an 8-song album, and you have 4 mega hits that we're all agreeing are amazing, I'd say it's a pretty good ratio.
Oh, it's definitely a good ratio. And
yeah, but still, Rob, come on.
Well, but I think, to Tom's point earlier, I think the delta between the Cream on the album and the rest of it, to me, it's like a super steep drop off.
Again, top Jimmy after Panama. Just saying, just putting it out there.
He's really overplaying on that song. He really is trying to make something out of nothing on that one.
Yeah, he didn't have like an acoustic composition in his repertoire that he could just sort of, refresh our ear with instead.
He's trying to eschew guitars, Phil.
That's more like 1986, like that era.
Well, and not to preempt anything that you're going to say, Tom, and I do feel like it's a somewhat decent connection to when we did Hysteria by Def Leppard recently that took 3+ years to record. The way they were cranking these albums out, I think I saw something like this took 3 months for them to do, and that seemed like it was forever for them. So it definitely seemed like they were just get in the studio, put the shit on tape, and we're not going to overthink any of this. And I think that comes through, for better or worse.
Alan, that is an amazing segue into our talk about the background of Van Halen. So I want to set the scene here. All right. It is 1982, and Van Halen, they're burned out. They've been relentlessly touring since their debut album was released in 1978. They have churned out an album a year since 1978, and because of the intense pressure from their label Warner Brothers, they have never taken more than 2 weeks to record, mix, and in most cases write these albums.
Cocaine's a hell of a drug.
Used to be healthy.
So the pressure and possibly the cocaine starting to fray the personal relationships in the band. David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen are particularly coming to blows a lot. In an attempt to buy themselves some space, they tell Warner Brothers they're going to go on a hiatus, but to make sure they stay in the public consciousness and to appease the record label, they say, we're going to release a cover of Roy Orbison's Pretty Woman. Just as a single, it'll make the label happy, keep the fans engaged. That will give us time to rest. That plan spectacularly backfires when Pretty Woman goes to number 12 on the charts. And Warner Brothers insists that they deliver an album to them within a few weeks. And so they have to go back into the studio and they rush. Then they do 1982's Diver Down, which has 5 of the 12 tracks as cover songs, including Dancing in the Street, which everybody except for David Lee Roth has said how much they hate that song, but David Lee Roth seems like he really likes that one. And the whole process really annoys Eddie. He feels like there's a lot of interference. He was forced to give more creative control to David Lee Roth and to producer Ted Templeman. It also just so happens that he realizes at this time that he lives a few minutes away from one of the few artists in the world that he actually respects, Frank Zappa. And so he makes contact and he heads over to Frank's home and he shows him his home studio, the Utility Muffin Kitchen, of course, as one would name it. Yeah.
Great name. That's, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So basically, Eddie's like, oh, that's why Zappa can make such weird music. It's because he has a studio where he can take as much time as he wants. There's nobody there to rein him in, nobody to tell him no. Eddie's got some money, so he decides he's going to build his own home studio, and they start work on 5150 Studios. He works with his longtime engineer, Don Landy, to design and build the studio, which they hilariously have to tell the city is a racquetball court because it's against the building codes to have a studio on the property. They also, because there is this like 150-foot tall radio tower relatively close to there, they have to cover it all in chicken wire and run a current through it to make it like a Faraday cage that the radio signals can't get through.
Brilliant.
It actually is quite brilliant. Yeah.
They were getting some lost shit now. Faraday cages.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this takes a while to be built. And during the time that this is being built, Eddie's kind of sitting around. He doesn't have a whole lot to do. He's been touring relentlessly for years. He sort of doesn't know what to do with himself. And we all know idle hands are the devil's workshop, and Eddie is not immune to temptation. So he starts to experiment with perhaps the most dangerous drug of all, the synthesizer. And the result of that experimentation is what becomes the smash hit album 1984. Now, before we get any further into the story, we're going to do a little bit of our favorite segment on the podcast. This is going to be Van Halen 1984 by the numbers.
Woo! All right.
The first number I'm going to throw out is 4. That is the total number of tracks on Van Halen albums that had featured any kind of keyed instrument before this album 1984 came out. So imagine the absolute tonal shift for the fans when they're like, you had like a Wurlitzer that was distorted and sounded like a guitar on a couple of tracks before, and then I play your first album and it's just doom synth to start off.
It is a long standalone synth intro to kick off the record into a synth heavy
I mean,
song.
it worked though. It's just right. It worked.
It's an overture. It's an overture.
It worked, but I would have thought I was listening to like one of those Weather Report albums from, like the late 70s.
I'm saying the synth part 2 jump kicking off the record is both a baller move for the reason Tom's describing it, and it's one of the most iconic synth parts ever put down.
Totally. Well, and I think that gets to the mode shifting that you talked about earlier, where in that song, I think they realized like, hey, we might be cutting it a little too close to the edge here. Let's just shift to a raging guitar solo in the middle of this, synth thing. And it definitely works.
Yeah. I feel like I must point out that on their previous album, Fair Warning, they did also have an instrumental synth track, this kind of dark instrumental synth track, which was supposed to represent Eddie's trepidation surrounding his impending wedding to Valerie Bertinelli. And trivia time, does anybody know where Valerie Bertinelli was born?
Panama.
Delaware.
Wilmington, fucking Delaware.
Wow.
Get out of
She
here.
was the daughter of a GM executive. And so,
Really listen to the Delaware boys really scraping the bottom of the celebrity barrel.
There's a great Saturday Night Live where Bertinelli is the host and Eddie Van Halen sits in with the band and might even sit in with the live band, but he's definitely not the musical guest.
They were married for kind of a long time. I think like into the 2000s they were married from 1984. So good for them.
She's awesome. Let's hear it for Val.
Yeah. Hell yeah. And she put up with a lot. Definitely put up with a lot.
Yeah.
Now, the next number that I'm going to throw out is 34. As in Van Halen sold 34 million records in the U.S. alone just during their time with David Lee Roth between 1977 and 1984, including 2 albums that reached diamond status, which is over 10 million units in the U.S., which is their debut album, Van Halen, and their last album with Roth, this one, 1984.
This is quintessential American music, right? I mean, does the rest of the world appreciate this anywhere close to how Americans do?
This definitely reeks of America 1984, right? Like this this is absolutely, yeah.
Does someone have the stats on like where else this record did well?
Let's see. Canada, 5 times platinum, 500,000 copies sold.
Too close. Somewhere else.
Japan, it went gold, sold 100,000 copies. It only went gold in the UK, selling 100,000 copies. So 10 million copies in the US, 100,000 copies in the UK. That's probably the biggest gulf I've seen in sales between those 2 countries.
That says a lot. That
Yeah.
explains a lot.
Went platinum in Germany, though, 500,000.
I think David was just he has such a cartoonish nature about him. Like, not that I'm saying that wouldn't fly. Like, there's a lot of characters in these other parts of the world, but uniquely American is definitely, I think, a good way to describe his approach to this.
He's like Bugs Bunny come to life. It's, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great way of saying it.
So the next number that we are going to throw out is 2. As in 1984 reached number 2 on the charts. Despite selling over 10 million copies, it never reached number 1. Because even though it was released more than a year before 1984, Michael Jackson's Thriller was still sitting at number 1 on the charts.
At least Eddie got a piece of that.
No, Eddie didn't get a piece. Remember that?
Eddie did not get paid. Yeah.
We covered that on the Thriller episode. He didn't even get paid for the session.
They got him drunk. That's it. Yeah.
That's compensation enough.
I think Eddie's doing okay.
We're referring to Eddie Van Halen taking the Beat It guitar solo for anyone who might not know.
So the last number that I'm going to throw out is 44. As in a 44 Magnum handgun, which is how they tested whether or not the rack that they had built into the wall of 5150 Studios was going to be stable and soundproof enough. So they figured, because they were doing a lot of cocaine, that the best thing to do was to get a 44 Magnum handgun and fire it into the wall and see if it could stand up to it. And it did.
That was smart.
Whose idea?
That was smart. That was, just go right for Max.
Whose idea do you think that was of the band? Really?
You know what? It was either Eddie or Don Landy, because they were the 2 that were really involved in the building of this. So one of the 2 of them, and apparently they were doing some very extremely long like overnight cocaine sessions that were.
And then firing guns indoors in their Faraday cage.
It's half studio, it's half panic room.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
America.
It's past physics experiment.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Doesn't happen in Canada, I'll tell you that.
It would have to be a hunting rifle in Canada, right? Or they would be like, all right, what if I do a really hard slap shot against this?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, wow.
Exactly.
Shots
I
fired.
think that has happened in several studios.
All right, before we get back into the album, I just want to take a quick moment to thank everybody who is listening along here. We absolutely love doing this every week. We love coming into your homes and your ear holes and delivering our snarky takes on great albums from very accomplished artists that we try to tear down as much as possible. If you want to support what we're doing, you can always go over to our Patreon page. You can join the conversation there. We have a whole lot of really great engaged fans that will leave comments, add some context to the week's episodes, and really just share in the overall joy of complaining. And so if you want to do that, 1001 Album Complaints at Patreon. If you want to get access to some of our bonus material, throw us $5 a month. There's a ton of bonus stuff up there, including our 2024 #1 song battles and lots of other great content to come. But for now, we're going to jump back into the story of Van Halen. Now, we left the story off in 1983, but we're actually going to go back farther in time to a very auspicious day in Amsterdam on May 8th, 1953, a day that changed rock and roll forever. That's right, I'm talking about the birth of Alex Van Halen. Now, Alex is the first son of Jan Van Halen, who was a Dutch pianist, saxophonist, and clarinet player. He had been in the Dutch Air Force. While he was serving in Indonesia, he meets Eugenia van Beers, who is an Indo woman. And I had to look up what that meant. It basically is a group of people that were both Dutch and Indonesian from the time that it was called the Dutch East Indies. And so they were a racially integrated group of people. And so they get married. They move back to Amsterdam. They have 2 sons, Alex, and then Eddie comes along in 1955. They're kind of musical prodigies from a young age. They are given lots of instructions. Their parents think, hey, maybe they're going to become classical pianists. But eventually they decide that the Netherlands is really not the place for them because they are getting a lot of grief for their mixed race marriage. And so they say, hey, we need to go someplace that is accepting of all races. And so they go to America in the 1960s, which of course there were no problems with that there.
Well said, well said.
So in 1962, Jan, Eugenia, Alex, and Eddie moved to Pasadena, California to start a new life in America. Now, we're going to leave them for a moment and we're going to travel back again to 1954 because that is the year that Michael Anthony Sobolewski and David Lee Roth are born. Michael is one of 5 kids, pretty standard Polish middle-class upbringing in Chicago. His dad was a trumpet player, early interest in music, all that good stuff. David Lee Roth was born in Bloomington, Indiana, which is the worst state in the entire United States of America, and y'all can fight me on that.
Tom, I love your consistency on this topic.
It's always Indiana.
It is always Indiana. Indiana's the worst state.
As a quick aside, when we were in Washington at a concert together 6 months ago, Tom casually dropped some Indiana reference, and the guys next to us were like, yo, we're from Indiana. They were super chill, but like it is very consistent. I will agree with that.
And then Tom immediately confronted them and said, your state is the worst in the union.
Yes.
Strangers.
Yes. I was relating this story about how 2 people pulled guns on me when I was in Indiana for over a span of like 6 hours.
You made it sound like they more showed you their guns to like.
Yeah. Okay.
Never lived until you've seen Poison in Indianapolis, though. Have you seen Bret Michaels ride his motorcycle on a stage in Indianapolis?
No.
That's living. That's seeing something.
I'm leaving some meat on the bones in this life, sounds like.
Is that like an annual? Can I check that out this year?
I don't think so. But I think he shouted out the word Indy about 45 times during one song.
That was smart.
Hello,
move.
Indy. Okay. Go. Carry on.
So, although David Lee Roth was born in Bloomington, Indiana, he just so happened to be the nephew of a man named Manny Roth, who opened the famous Cafe Wha in Greenwich Village in New York City in 1959.
Whoa, that's wild.
David would go spend time with his uncle in the early 60s and go to these shows when he was like 7 to 12. He saw Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, the Velvet Underground, like all getting their starts at this very small
That's crazy. It's a crazy
cafe club. And also, you wonder why he turned into like a coke fiend party animal. You're like taking him to Velvet Underground shows when he's 10 years old.
Yeah, that's why I don't take my kids to these cool places.
Can we just take a beat to recognize the breadth of artists that were playing at that club? Probably at the exact same time. Bob Dylan, Hendrix, and the Velvet Underground. I mean, that is breadth.
Yeah, seriously. You don't know what kind of drugs you should be doing for the show. You show up and like, I fucked up. Sorry, I didn't realize it was a heroin night. Sorry.
Speaking of which, now since we're talking about his bio, is Lee his real middle name? Because that Lee is doing a lot of heavy lifting in David Lee Roth.
I believe it is his real middle name. Yeah.
David Roth sounds like an accountant or an actuary or pillar of the community.
Well, I mean, his dad was a very well-respected eye surgeon. And so he was not middle class. He was way upper class, very wealthy. And sounded like maybe a little too cosmopolitan for Indiana because they moved to Pasadena, California when he's in his early teens around like 1964, 1965. It also so happens that Michael Sobolewski's family also moves to very nearby Arcadia, California in 1966. It's just like 10 minutes down the road from Pasadena. So 1966, we got Alex, Eddie, David, and Michael. They've all relocated from very different places to settle in the general Pasadena area of LA. A collision course with history is about to happen, but it's going to take a little bit of time. One of the things that I did not think about is that you look at the history of Van Halen and you look at the history of a lot of bands that have siblings in it. And usually it's the two brothers that want to kill each other all the time and end up breaking the band up. That never happened with Van Halen. Eddie and Alex were the two consistent members. And apparently one of the things that really solidified that bond that they had was when they first moved to the US, they did not know how to speak English. And so for quite some time, they could only communicate with each other. And it was very hard to make friends. And so they formed this bond. It was kind of them against the world. And they carried that through to their music. I really expected that there was going to be a lot more butting heads between them. But it sounds like they've always gotten along famously, which I think is pretty cool.
My brother and I would have killed each other if we could only talk to each other. That would have been a nightmare.
So soon after moving to the U.S., Alex's parents buy him a guitar. He sets to learning it, but he kind of sucks. He wants to stick with it. He doesn't get discouraged. Eddie convinces his parents to buy him a drum set, but says, I will get a paper route to pay you back for the drum set. But while Eddie is out earning the money from the paper route in the blistering summer Pasadena sun, Alex is secretly at home playing his drums all the time and basically gets to the point where he is just as good, if not better, than Eddie on the drums. And then Eddie starts playing his guitar, and it turns out that Eddie was pretty damn good at the guitar. Alex says that when he was in early high school and Eddie was still in grade school, he goes out with his friends to kind of like party one night, and he comes back and Eddie's been sitting on the bed in the exact same spot the entire time. And he goes, oh, hey, I learned Crossroads, and plays all of Crossroads note for note, including the Eric Clapton solos. And it's just like, yeah, I just learned this by ear. I picked it up. And so Alex was like, you should probably stick to the guitar. And I think I'll stick to the drums here. And I think it was probably a pretty good call for them. So they end up starting some bands, playing a lot of backyard parties. And this is one of the things that I thought was like really interesting. Apparently, in this time of Pasadena, the thing to do was just to throw backyard parties with bands. And people were generally cool with it. Like sometimes they get broken up by the cops, but mostly you would just get a couple of kegs and have a band play in the backyard. And that's what people would do on the weekends. That was kind of what the social scene was like.
I did know this about Van Halen, that they sort of emerged out of like a Pasadena party scene, and that they didn't have a normal sort of road, I don't want to say to the top, but to a record deal.
Yeah. So they're playing in these backyard parties. And like all bands, they start out kind of slow, playing a lot of cover songs. At this point, Eddie is singing and playing guitar. They have a different bass player, and they have Alex on drums. They call themselves the Trojan Rubber Company. So the horn dogness might not have just come from David Lee Roth. That might have been baked into the product from the beginning.
David Lee Roth and the Magnums wasn't available.
But David Lee Roth does actually see them play early on, and he is very much like, oh, wow, I want to be in that band. I found this to be an interesting quote. What he said was, what he does with his hands, I want to do with my feet. I want to do with my voice. And like you said, feet first. That was the important thing to you. Is I need to be able to do these kicks and jumps. The singing part will come later.
It's a lot of gymnastics and being the front man of Van Halen.
What's funny, the feet are connected to the voice. I teach people this, actually.
No.
Yeah. When you go for a high note, any of you next time you go for a high note, think of your feet and ground yourself in. But I mean, I don't think David Lee Roth was grounding himself into the earth at any point.
Maybe that's why Van Morrison does all those kicks in that Last Waltz video. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, those are classic.
Really? No, he does like 10 of them at the end of it's a great performance.
Maybe that's fueled by something else.
So Trojan Rubber Company, they break up when their bass player's dad gets a job out of LA because they're still like in high school. But they get a new guy named Mark Stone. And they're like, all right, we're going to change our name. Trojan Rubber Company. It's probably not the greatest name. We should just call ourselves Genesis. And they apparently have no idea that there's a very successful band named Genesis with several albums out by this point.
Wow.
I'm guessing the Trojan thing was in the air because they're pretty close to USC, and that's their mascot, right?
Yeah, probably. But
that was part of it.
There's layers to that name, Rob. It's a very,
there's layers.
Sophisticated name, yes. So they, of course, realize that there's another band called Genesis that's already put out a gold record. So they changed their name to Mammoth. And at this point, they start getting a buzz around them as a band. And this is the thing that I thought was like really interesting is that people would say that you'd booked Van Halen for your party and you'd have about 45 minutes before like literal police helicopters would have to show up because thousands of people would start coming to these parties. One of the quotes is that the cops said, we thought the party was 4 blocks away because that's when we started running into people that were like congregating. And then we had to make our way through 4 blocks of people congregating to actually get to where the party was.
Damn.
Which has got to feel pretty damn good.
I think we were born in the wrong place and time and with much less talent.
I agree with all those things.
Hey, yes. we played some parties in college that were pretty cool that didn't get broken up. Yeah. So David Lee Roth is the frontman of a different band called Red Ball Jet at this time, starting to develop his frontman persona. They're more like an R&B cover band, but they get booked at a battle of bands with Mammoth, and that's where David finally officially meets Eddie and Alex. They kind of like each other's moxie. Eddie and Alex are like, hey, we're going to show these guys up, and Dave's like, bring it on, motherfucker. I don't give a shit. And you know, there's a respect for each other, what each other are bringing to the table there. So they're like, you know, a couple of months later, they start thinking, we really need to get a front man. Alex says that he went to Eddie and was like, you can't sing and play guitar well enough to be a front man. You have to just be a guitar player. We'll get a front man. You're not very charismatic. The thing that was hilarious is that what apparently sealed the deal for David Lee Roth getting into the band, he had auditioned a couple of times and did not get it. And they had been renting his PA from him when they had to provide their own sound for shows. And they were like, you know what? If we just bring him in the band, we're going to save that $10 that we're paying him to rent his PA. So he got into the band so that they could save $10 on PA rentals.
You know what? That story checks out, man. That is how it works. Oh, this guy has a van?
Yeah.
Let's do it. He's in.
So Dave is the one who, when he joins the band, he's like, Mammoth, that's kind of boring. You should change the name of your band to Van Halen. People already know Eddie's a great guitar player. It's compact. It's euphonious. Let's just be Van Halen. They officially become Van Halen. Keep playing on this party scene. They are starting to get to the point where it's kind of untenable for them to play these backyard parties. As I said, they couldn't really play even full sets because they were getting broken up.
Can we pause on that? So David Lee Roth suggested the name change. That was maybe the last non-egotistical thing he did in his life, right?
That is a shocker.
Yeah. I thought it was, you know, good marketing on his part. Van Halen's a great name.
No, it's a great name. It was a good call, but still.
Do you think that they're following in the Van Morrison footsteps a little bit? Because that's unusual, I think, to just use your last name as the band. Or was it? Maybe it wasn't.
Yeah, this is before Bon Jovi.
Hanson.
And yes, and Hanson. You know,
I was going to say, wasn't Sammy Hagar around the same time in a band called Montrose that was named after the singer's, or sorry, the guitar player's last name?
Yeah, maybe it was a thing already.
But there also is like there's like a cadence Van Halen, Van Morrison. Like it feels like,
Sure.
Although obviously this isn't setting the right expectation at all. If you're like, oh, let me get this Van Halen record, it's probably like Van Morrison because that's the way it works.
Actually, the funny thing is that when they finally got booked on the Sunset Strip, they got booked at this place, Gazzari's, and the owner thought that David Lee Roth's name was Van Halen. Like Van was his friend. He would just call him Van all the time. Be like, hey, Van, what's up? You guys are doing great tonight. And he's just like, yeah, sure, whatever. I guess I'll be Van as long as you keep booking me. So they have kind of outgrown this party scene. They start getting booked in LA, places like that. But their bass player, Mark Stone, is like not quite committed to the band. He doesn't know if he wants to be a professional musician. And so he's kind of hemming and hawing about it. And they kick him out of the band, which has got to be one of the most crippling financial moves that has ever happened to somebody. Like if he had just taken it a little bit more seriously, he could have been worth $40 million by this point because he would have gotten equal writing credit. But they kick him out of the band. And in shockingly, another PA-related incident. Van Halen is playing a show with a band called Snake, and Van Halen's PA blows up, and the bass player from Snake comes over and says, hey, man, we got a PA. You can use ours. And that man is Michael Anthony. And that is how he gets introduced to them. And they're like, hey, we're looking for a new bass player. You should join our band. And then he joins their band. So kids out there, the best investment in your musical career is to buy a PA. And if you're interested, I have 2 of them in my garage right now that I'm looking to get rid of.
This is all just one long infomercial for Tom to sell some used gear. No, this is a far cry from the a story I came across in researching some of this. I don't know if you'll get to this, but I found it funny that apparently when Eddie Van Halen was first introduced to Sammy Hagar at one point, they were introduced through their quote mutual Ferrari mechanic.
Yes.
So their connections seem to change a little bit over the years.
It was a different life in Pasadena in 1980.
Yeah.
So they start to get more popular, and this actually, I believe, came up on our Kiss episode. But they're playing at a place called the Starlight. Gene Simmons happens to be in the crowd, sees them, loves them, says, you know what? I'm going to try to get you guys a record deal. Flies them out to New York on his own dime, produces 13 songs for them, and says, like, I'm going to get you a record deal. Takes it to Kiss's management, and they say, this band does not have what it takes, and they pass on Van Halen.
Wow.
Again.
They don't even wear makeup, man.
You know what? I bet you Dave was wearing some kind of makeup at the time, probably.
I mean, the Jack Daniels bass can't hang with the Axe bass, apparently, in the marketing scheme.
So Gene Simmons, in a way that's actually pretty cool, like he could have held on to them, but he rips up their contract and says, take the demo, that's on me. Just go try to get yourself a record contract.
I like that he didn't go any further with it. It was just like, oh, hit a wall.
Yeah.
Give up.
I tried one time and it didn't work. Well, yeah, he asked his management, and it's like, you don't have any other connections? You just like asked the first person that you had in your phone and gave up after that? But that demo does get them a manager, Marshall Burrell, the son of Milton Berle, and he brings that to Warner Brothers' chair, Mo Austin, and producer Ted Templeman. He brings them to see a show. They like it so much, they write out a letter of intent on a bar napkin. This leads to a monumentally shitty record contract where Van Halen is making 70 cents per album and is locked into a tour that the record company is going to finance, but Van Halen will owe them $1 million for at the end of it.
Jeez.
So, of course, they signed this contract.
I thought leaving a show with like a $40 bar tab was the worst. You could be in the red after a performance, but apparently not.
Yeah, no, well, they signed the contract, and that leads to the February 1978 album Van Halen, which goes platinum in just a few months. So at this point, the rocket ship is officially taken off. It's a landmark work of metal and pop, literally changing the way that guitar players approach the instrument to this day, basically. Once that album comes out, the record company puts them on tour with Journey and Montrose, and they essentially tour for 11 months nonstop. They become crazy party animals on this tour. as they said, that they would play first. And they're like, well, we would just be done first. And then we would have an entire concert to just hang out at backstage with all the groupies and everything and have a good old time. So that seemed pretty great. They also then start completely trashing hotel rooms in just the most ridiculously dickish fashion. We've talked about this before. I don't understand that, but apparently they love to do it. Just petty vandalism at like a Ramada Inn in Des Moines, Iowa or something like that really did it for them.
You know, if there's ever a strange turn of events and I become a rock star, I'm going to get like TaskRabbit people to come in and just paint the hotel room. Like, well, you know, so it's
Modern.
so it's just like a really obnoxious
It
comment.
reminds me of one of my favorite Onion headlines that just said Christian rock band cleans up hotel room.
That's good. That was good. So after they're done touring with Journey and Montrose, they get booked on a tour with notable teetotalers, Black Sabbath, in England. And they said that they were apparently blowing them off the stage every night. And even Ozzy said that Van Halen, like they didn't like that tour with Van Halen because when they came on, they felt like it was a step down for Black Sabbath. And so after that tour, they were never openers again. They finished the tour in November 1978. Their debut album has sold 2.5 million copies in that time. They go right into the studio. They record Van Halen 2. That goes platinum almost right away as well. They go back out on tour immediately, tour all the way up to December 1979, when they go right back into the studio and record 1980's Women and Children First. It's another hit. That's got the Cradle Will Rock, Everybody Wants Some. It's a huge album. 1981, they're set to record their fourth album, Fair Warning. Again, they've just gotten on a huge tour. They get done. Eddie is like, I have a vision for this album. I want to exert a lot more creative control over it. I want it to be kind of darker. I want it to be kind of heavier. And David Lee Roth is like, I want to sound like sunshine and sex and cocaine. And they really start to come to a creative impasse around that. And Eddie kind of puts his foot down and says, listen, I know you think we have a formula that works. That's fine. I know you want to do fun pop metal. That's fine. But I'm the driving force and talent in this band, and we're going to do what I want to do. And they end up recording 1982's Fair Warning. Now, Fair Warning, again, it's darker. It's the one that's described as like a guitar player's favorite Van Halen album. It's like super guitar technical and guitar forward. But it's also the worst selling album of the David Lee Roth era of Van Halen. So as I'm sure you can imagine, David Lee Roth is like super cool about it and doesn't say I told you so or anything like that. Just
Yeah. He doesn't like blow a whistle in his face or like do all his cocaine. You know?
Do splits in front of him while going, told you so. Okay. But, you know, Dave does think that it vindicates his approach, especially when their follow-up album, which is the one that we talked about at the beginning, Diver Down, where he took a much heavier creative hand in, ends up selling twice as well as Fair Warning. Now, that's the one that has a bunch of kind of cheesy covers on it, but that's sort of David Lee Roth's lane. He came up as the frontman in a cover band doing that sort of flamboyant, act. He's also getting really into making music videos. He is taking advantage of this persona that he's built up and cashing in on it in a way that I don't hate him for it, but I can see why somebody like Eddie Van Halen might be like, this is less creatively productive. You're just kind of like milking a gimmick over and over again. Not like my finger tapping, not a gimmick at all that I'm melting in any way, shape, or form. So one thing to also bear in mind is that Eddie is over this time becoming more and more of an alcoholic. And listen, I'm not saying that Dave was a saint or anything like that. He was certainly doing a lot of drugs, but you always kind of get the sense that Dave was like doing drugs with other people. And you kind of get the sense that Eddie was sort of drinking with Eddie a lot. And it was a lot less of a fun party good time and a lot more of like, I'm sitting in a darkened hotel room slugging a bottle of Jack because I just
George Thorogood style.
Yes, exactly. So after Diver Down is kind of successful, Eddie was really frustrated with that. He hates the album and he wants nothing to do with that again. Dave and Ted Templeman, they were the ones who really were the driving force behind that album. He felt like the studio was really interfering and pushing them to do something. So that brings us to spring 1983. Eddie has built 5150 Studios, and they now have the luxury of spending a leisurely 3 months to record their 6th studio album, which, again, I feel like every other band was taking 8-9 months of doing whatever the hell they wanted to record their albums in the Caribbean or something like that. And Eddie's like, I guess I'll take 3 months at my own house to record this album. Still seems a little rushed.
Get in the Faraday cage.
Faraday cage is probably slowly giving me cancer. So,
yeah, that never came up.
because it's Eddie's studio, he gets to call all the shots. And the one thing that he wants to do is to play keyboards. This had apparently been a big bone of contention between Eddie and Dave and Ted Templeman, where Eddie had tried to put more keys in songs in the past, but was overruled. And in fact, he had given the demo for Jump to Dave in 1982. And their response was, Eddie, nobody wants to hear you play the fucking keyboards. Stick to the guitar. And I can see why they said that, but goddamn, were they wrong. That was not a great call on their part.
Jump was a hit. Agreed.
It's easy to see kind of both sides of it because as a band, you have to keep moving forward and evolving creatively. And so that involves taking chances and trying new shit. But it was a little jarring, even though they started to pepper it in a little bit before this record. It's so drastically different. And synth, I've never cared much for synth, period. Like, it's somehow sounded dated to me even back in the 80s, if somehow. And so I can kind of understand both perspectives, but all parties would have to agree it was the right thing to do in retrospect.
I think they did it in such a musical way as well. Like, think of what Neil Young did with that Trans record. This didn't go there.
Yeah, it holds up better than a lot of stuff could have, for sure.
Yeah.
What's the McCartney record? Fireman? It's more might be a DJ record.
Listen, I got to be honest. Every time I hear Jump, I think about Born in the USA. And both of them have that cut through synth sound on it. But I think it works a lot better in Jump than on Born in the USA. And I know Rob's going to shake his head at that one. But maybe it's just because the Born in the USA one just doesn't change,
I mean, it works great in both. Obviously, the record shows that it's great.
You must choose.
Well, I mean, listen, if we're going just on sales means it's good, I think that there's a couple of inclusions on this list that will maybe prove that that's not the case. But either way, in 5150 Studios, Eddie and Alex are basically putting down almost all of the bed tracks. They even cut out the producer, Ted Templeman. He's listed as their producer, but according to everybody, including Ted himself, he had almost nothing to do with this album, and they just sort of put him on there because he had produced all their other albums, and they felt like they had to. Eddie even writes most of the bass lines, and it's not confirmed, but there is a rumor that that's actually him playing the bass on Hot for Teacher, and that he had to dumb down his original version of it so that Michael Anthony could play it live. I don't know if that's true or not. And
Poor Michael Anthony.
I know.
He actually, by all accounts, is a decent bass player. I think it's just that he didn't really have much runway. I refuse to believe that he couldn't play whatever line was presented to him.
Didn't he end up in a band with Sammy Hagar called Chicken Neck or something? What's that?
Chicken
Foot? Yeah.
And Chad Smith from the Chili Peppers.
Yeah,
Right.
Super group.
So the one thing that is actually kind of interesting about Michael Anthony is that he married Sue Hendry in 1981. That was his high school sweetheart. And they are, I'm pretty sure, still married to this day, which you go through the entire rise of Van Halen and your relationship does not fall apart. You got to be a pretty decent dude because there was a lot of opportunities to not be a decent dude out there.
Let's hear it for them.
I did read that he was one of the more subdued members of the band, despite the, Jack Daniels bass and
One of? You mean the only one?
well, I don't know about the drummer. I don't know what antics he was involved in, but
So when they are doing this album, they are trying to do it in secret because they're a little worried that they're going to get a lot of interference from the studio around it, because the studio is like, we signed a metal band. We didn't sign a fucking pop band. Don't give me this pop crap. I want to hear some metal. And so it got to the point where Eddie and Don Landy would hide the master tapes when Ted Templeman came, because not only was Ted Templeman their producer, he was also a VP at Warner Brothers. So whenever he would come over, they would like take the tapes off the reel, and Don Landy would like run to some other part of the property and hide with the tapes because they didn't want anybody to interfere with them. It got to the point where they thought that they were never going to deliver it because they kept saying it was done and they were just mixing it and it was taking forever, which by the way was like 2 weeks. Like, it's taking forever. It's like 2 weeks is not really that long, but okay. And Ted Templeman takes an entire set of like backup reels and tries to mix his own version of the album because he's like, I don't think it's ever going to get delivered. But eventually Ed and Don Landy do deliver the final product that you hear. It gets mastered, but that's the mix that they did together. And I think there might be some issues with the mix. I don't think it's that great of a mix. They were apparently also like on like psychotically long cocaine and alcohol binges at the time. And they were very worried that they were going to literally burn the master tapes at one point. And I can understand where the record company is coming from. You got a band that their worst selling album so far is 2 million copies. You know that you got to get something out there. You got to get something going. And the result is such a smash hit. Even listening to this album and understanding the context, I was a little taken aback by the fact that this went diamond. I didn't quite understand how much of a hit Jump and Panama and Hot for Teacher were. I mean, they were pretty massively selling songs, let alone I'll Wait, which we did not include on the focus list, which we are going to get into right now. I think we've gabbed a little bit enough about the overall dynamics leading up to this album. We can talk a little bit later about what happened after the album, which basically is Van Halen broke up and Sammy Hagar came in. And there was a great quote from one of the Warner Brothers record executives. It might have been Ted Templeton, where Sammy Hagar came in and one of the first things that they did was they played Why Can't This Be Love in the room. And the guy said, I smell money. And I was like, oh, that's just such a fucking scumbag record executive thing to say. But he was right. That album sold a hell of a lot. Anyway, let's get into it. We're going to jump back into the first track that we played. This is
so ubiquitous. I've heard it too many times in my life. I don't completely love it, but I do have to respect it for what it is. For the reasons we talked about, right? The bold choice of just kicking it off with synth and ultimately creating one of the most iconic synth parts of all time. But actually, I have a logistical question because I noticed that there's no live recordings of this band from this era. At least non-bootleg ones, not official releases. When they play it live, does Eddie just have the guitar slung behind him and switch? How do you think that works?
You know what he might have it on is that weird like harness thing that he had that sort of made it sit at an angle in front of him. We haven't talked about that like harness that he had that he invented to make it so that the guitar sat so he could tap on the neck more easily. That'll be my guess, is that he's playing that. I wonder, though, they said that Michael Anthony played keys for the band on stage a lot. So it might have been him playing the synth for this because there's not really a whole lot going on in the bass.
Yeah, and it definitely has the like sub-octave bass part right on the synth.
Which is my least favorite synth presentation, the eighth note, dun 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 dun. I don't like that.
Unless it's I'll Wait.
No, not even then.
I think one of your listeners is going to have the answer to how this was performed live. Right?
I'm sure someone has seen them live.
A very long paragraph, a detailed paragraph.
I just want to know if Eddie played the keys or if Michael Anthony played the keys as a standard. Because it kind of does, not just the eighth note bass that you're talking about, but the first sound of the song is somebody hitting a bass note on the synth and holding it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You get this bass rumble.
Maybe he's got the Geddy Lee set up where he's got the keys nearby him and can.
Actually, this is a pretty good question because I actually think like it's a post guitar solo thing. I actually like the section right after the guitar solo. There's a bit of a keyboard breakdown, and you can hear a bit of like Red Light Fever in the performance. Like you can hear that there's a little tension, that there's a little like nervousness. Like I'm pretty fucking deep, and like I gotta close this part out here.
Right.
This is the complicated keyboard pass, and you can hear a little bit of anxiety. Right.
Do that like arpeggiated. That shit is intense.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. He nails it, but like you can hear a little tension in there, like a little anxiety in the player.
Well, I mean, fast arpeggios have long been a hallmark of Eddie Van Halen's playing with all the tapping stuff. The doodly doodly.
But, hearing it on a keyboard reminds you that is really a move from classical music.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he was classically trained.
That part sounded exactly like when it came out of the solo into that heavy arpeggiated part. I thought I was listening to like a Rocky training montage or something. Like it was just like,
Okay.
I was ready to shadow box a little bit.
Speaking of the so-called red light fever, where you're nervous about the take, he makes a mistake at 126, right? He hits a single chord way too up high, and then he immediately backs down an octave. And it's not discordant, but it's a flub.
Well, you have to understand, though, they were used to this brutal recording process where they kept mistakes on the tape, and they were just okay with that. That had to be part of it. If you have 2 weeks to record, write, and mix an entire album, you're going to have to leave mistakes on the tape. So I think that their threshold for mistakes was pretty high.
Wait, are you talking about the dun, dun, like that really high note that he hits?
It's right after the first chorus. He goes up high for exactly one hit. It's not discordant. It fits the song, but he's in the wrong octave, and he pulls.
But it felt maybe more organic to me than being a flub or something. But
it might have been a happy accident, but I doubt that he wrote it that way, where it's like, I'm just going to jump up for just one hit and then jump back down. That's possible.
It jumps out to me as a little weird. It's possible. It's purposeful, of course. Can someone who saw them live tell me if he hit that?
Can Valerie Bertinelli, the next time she's in Delaware, just stop on by and let us know? I got to give Dave credit on this one. I actually think this melody is pretty good. That you got to roll with the punches. I don't think of Dave as having a particularly fantastic voice. And I know, based upon my performance of that, I don't have much room to talk shit. But
It's all right.
does a pretty damn good job on this song.
I think it's great melodically. And that and the next part, can't you see you got me here, my back against the rack and machine? Yeah, I think it's very well crafted.
is it weird that he apparently was influenced by watching someone almost jump to their death and then use that to come up with just a super throwaway, go for it, guys. Like, yeah, jump. I don't know. I always found that. I guess you can find inspiration from anywhere, but that seemed a little strange to me.
Dave will take any subject matter and turn it into, we should probably have sex. That's basically the way that all of these work. I think that the guitar solo, really weird and angular. And it's this straight ahead pop song. And they're like, how about we just give you like 16 bars of weird angular beat with crazy guitar solo? It's a bold choice.
Yeah, and it's a reminder, again, it's like the classical reference. Like, he plays a lot of notes in a way that is difficult to do on guitar unless you're Eddie Van Halen.
That is an understatement, Phil.
Yeah, I feel like if we got the three of you, because you play guitar, yes?
Very sparsely, yeah.
I'll still count you in there.
All
if we got the three of you, you might be able to like take certain notes and perform this Eddie Van Halen guitar solo between the three of you as guitar players. Like, that might be possible.
You split it, somehow. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, I think we could learn the part at this point. Maybe I'm stretching, but I think it would be very hard to get the tonality. Like, he gets all these weird little pinch harmonics and swells, and there's so much feel baked into the technique.
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, would be the hardest
Sweeping.
part.
There's so much sweeping ease.
Exactly.
That is a perfect segue into the next song on our focus list. This is the also smash hit song, Panama. The reason that I said that was a perfect segue, at the beginning of this song, It sounds like he is hitting the strings with like a knife or something like that. It is such a cutting tone, and it sounds like the amp is about to explode. It's amazing. I don't know how you get that sound.
Yeah, okay, great. I can answer that question. We didn't stage this, but this is actually in my notes. This is the Brown sound. This is the Eddie Van Halen sound. I've got a Stratocaster. I fucking ripped all the guts out and put a single Les Paul humbucker in the bridge. I ran it into a Fender 100-watt plexi turned up to 10. Into that, I've got a phaser or a flanger. I've got the Echoplex, but it's just like barely on, but it's pushing the front of the broken up amp more. It's like he's got the whammy bar, so he's got all the Jeff Beck, Jimi Hendrix stuff, but he has like a totally different tone. I mean, like this didn't really exist before Van Halen, like the super Strat, like a Stratocaster with 2 humbuckers in it. Like, yeah, it's definitely a sound.
You know, Phil, that was a rhetorical question, by the way. You didn't have to actually get that answer. I didn't need that. You just said he turned it up loud.
Yeah, listeners, where are you going? Get back here.
This song is so good. It's such a great rock song.
So good.
To paraphrase Morgan Wallen, and as you know, I'm trying to limit my quotes of Morgan Wallen to only a handful an episode. This would sound great on a boat.
Yeah, this is like a quintessential Van Halen song. I feel like all the things they do well, among a few other ones on this record, but when I think of Van Halen, it has all the constituent parts. It has the frat boy kind of energy. It's got the raging guitar, the beefy riff. It just feels very Van Halen to me.
The David Lee Roth talking. You know, that's
the bridge is perfect. It does everything a bridge is supposed to do. This should be in the dictionary next to bridge. What is its function? It chills things out. It changes up the groove. It does a seamless key shift to help with that feel. It goes from, I think, an E major to an E minor, or an E flat major to an E flat minor, something like that. And most importantly, it revs you back in to the chorus again with what I think is just a chromatic walk up, but it all just feels very smooth and composed. It's perfect.
Hell yeah. I'm pretty sure this entire album is tuned down a half step. I think Eddie Van Halen thought that gave him just a little bit more slinkiness and play in the strings, and that's why he decided to do it. I'm sure it was not out of consideration for Dave's vocal range, because it sounds like he didn't give a shit about that, but he's like, I'm just going to tune it all down.
Let's talk about why David Lee Roth is the best possible vocalist for this band, though. And I'm going to point you to timestamp 18 seconds, where Eddie's guitar sting sounds exactly like Diamond Dave's vocals.
That is very interesting.
Oh, it really does.
If you start listening for it, you will hear a lot more of those throughout the record. I just picked this one spot. But Dave does a thing with his voice where he goes up and then it almost like he gets a pinch harmonic out of his voice and he squeals.
He does that a lot. Yeah, that's the Little Richard thing it reminded me of. Yeah.
And it really reminds me of Eddie's guitar playing. So they really are synergistic.
Yeah. I also love the fact that this was in response to a reporter telling him that he only wrote songs about partying, women, and cars. And he was like, wait, I've never written a song about a car. I should write a song about how I want to fuck a car.
Right. That's hilarious.
It took me a long time to figure out that he was not talking about having sex with women in this song. And I was like, I guess you could see that he's talking about a car, but everything he does bleeds sex.
I always assumed it was somehow about cocaine. I don't know. You know, cocaine can flow through Panama, right?
It was the era of everyone doing a song about a car, though, right?
Well, yeah, I feel like that started with like Mark Bolan back in the day.
Oh, I was going to say the Beach Boys, but yeah.
Well, the little red Corvette.
Well, I'm specifically talking about wanting to fuck cars. I think that was a Mark Bolan.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry. That's its
the
own
history
genre.
of wanting to
Yeah.
fuck cars.
Sure. We're going to publish that playlist in the notes.
Yeah.
Guys, I'm going to take a break here and work on that playlist.
So, did you guys notice that David Lee Roth says "boinin' down the avenue" instead of "burning"?
At least
Both
twice.
times. Yes.
It's an Indiana thing, Rob.
I'm glad you pointed that out because that really leapt out at me.
That sounds maybe more like a New York thing. Maybe that's from Manny Roth, his uncle, giving him that in the summer. Yeah.
Yes. That's what I was getting. It's a very New York pronunciation.
Yeah.
Wonderful tribute.
So the ending of this song, I feel like a professional mixer would have done it differently because the
Agreed.
band doesn't hit that last beat. And I know that they're trying to highlight the Panama line, but if you just did a tight hit, it still would have had plenty of anima after the anima. You know, it would have been.
It's weird.
Yeah, it's weird. It sounds wrong.
It definitely stands out.
Yeah, I've always read it as wrong. I know what they were trying to do, but I don't think they nailed it.
Yeah. Yeah, just put that hit in. And again, I think that by the time they were delivered the master, they were like, whatever, just let's get this thing printed. We've been waiting a grand total of like 12 days. This is ridiculous. We have to get this one out.
That's a good point because it sounds very much like what almost definitely happened was the band did hit the last hit, but somebody's just on the sliders, just pulling them all back right at the last second. And that's weird.
Yeah. Yep. And not a pro move. Not a pro move at all. At least they didn't do any weird panning. That would give us a lot more content for the show, but it would make for a worse product.
Oh, there's quite a bit of panning there, especially in the intro.
Uh-oh.
You know, we could.
You've awoken the beast.
That was not an invitation.
Just gonna let it be.
All right. Well, speaking of a worse product, we're going to go on to the next song on our focus list. This is Drop Dead Lead.
We really should invite everybody to listen to the segue from Panama to Top Jimmy because it is particularly obnoxious.
It really is.
Yeah, I'm kind of regretting not putting Top Jimmy on the list, Em. I think you're right. That one deserved its moment in the sun.
So this one, if you just dropped me into this groove without the vocals, I would swear up and down it was a Led Zeppelin song.
Totally, that's a great call. Yeah, feels like it could be like the ocean or something.
Yeah, something from the later period.
I thought it had like a I've got a feeling vibe in those first few chords in the beginning. And I obviously was not going to stick with that, but this song had a nice little vibe to it. I'm not a lyrics guy, but some of the lyrics were a little embarrassing on this one.
The lyrics and melody both struggle a bit here. I would agree, but I think the groove is pretty good, but it does to me sound a lot like he's aping Jimmy Page more directly here.
I think my biggest issue is that it's just a little plodding. Like, I think they operate better at a higher BPM, a little bit more bring the party, and a little bit less this kind of like slow head nod beat that they have going on.
Agreed.
But I do have a question. Have any of you ever had the confidence to tell somebody, a romantic partner, you know you want it? Like, that chorus is so goddamn creepy. You know that you want it. Like, oh God.
Yeah.
I know why Dave says that.
It was a very 80s thing
Yeah.
to tell people what they wanted.
Yes.
They're like the Foreigner, do you do more than dance?
Yes.
Very 80s.
It's very much like, I know that you're telling me that you don't want it, but trust me, you know you want it.
Also, just inserting giant butt into the lyrics like 8 years before Sir Mix-a-Lot did it. It was pretty ahead of his time.
He's a visionary.
You know, Wordsworth.
I just think that this song, this is the one that is my low point of the album. I thought it sounded pretty stock. And Rob, I don't disagree with you that this could be like a Led Zeppelin song, but Led Zeppelin was old at that point. Like, their sound was stale. And I think the best thing about Van Halen was when they were bringing kind of new stuff to the table. And so them aping an older sound, it didn't really do it for me. I expected better from them. I was a little disappointed.
I see. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't really have a low point. I enjoyed the record through and through. There were definitely peaks and valleys, but even the low points were pretty high for me, including this.
Yeah, well, fair enough. I will say the lyrics at the end of the second verse were like, for an entire stanza, David Lee Roth just goes, ah, ooh, ah, baby. It's like, that's what you say when you don't write lines and you're just like, I'll fill this in later. I'll write the lines later, don't worry.
I definitely think that's a trend, at least on this record, and kind of with David Lee Roth in general, but definitely on this record. Like, it definitely feels like the lyric writing phase got skipped.
Well, there's no phase. There's not some dedicated phase of it. It's just like, let me just throw this shit onto a notepad.
You know what he would do? He would apparently have his security guard drive him around the streets of LA in a like 1950s Chevy convertible while he wrote lyrics in the back seat. That's how he would get inspired. That was his process.
That was his muse.
Yeah. And I'm sure that 90% of that was him like wolf whistling to women walking down the street instead of actually focusing on the words. So maybe Maybe he had a person next to him that was transcribing what he was saying, and that was when he was yelling at some woman walking down the street, and they got the baby.
No. Given what you said, dig those moves, vampire, set me loose, get it higher, throw my rope, loop-de-loop, night, white teeth, Betty Boop. Yeah, this is all making sense now. Set it cool. Real heavy. I ain't fooled. Getting ready.
It's foreshadowing the solo work. You know?
Yeah.
Loop de loop.
Very much so.
You could argue that the hits are the ones where the lyrics really work, because I think those lyrics in songs like Panama and Jump and our next song are all great.
Yes. And I think specifically that the choruses work very well in those songs. So let's go on to the next song on the focus list. This is Hot for Teacher.
Oh, wow, man. Wait a second, man. What do you think the teacher's going to look like this year? Teacher, stop that screaming. Teacher, don't you see? Don't want to be no uptown fool. Maybe I should go to hell, but I'm doing well. Teacher needs to see me after school. I think of all the education that I missed, but then my homework was never quite like this. Oh, got it bad, got it bad, got it bad. I'm hot for teacher.
So the first fact that I got to throw out there blew my fucking mind. This is an E-drum kit that he is recording this on.
What?
Because the studio in 5150, the actual studio space was very small and there was a ton of bleed and they couldn't get a track with Eddie and Alex playing together with a real drum kit. So this is an E-drum kit. And the lore is that at the beginning of the song, that's not actually drums. That is the exhaust of Eddie's Ferrari that they put a microphone up to. And that kind of, that's apparently the exhaust.
I was wondering about that. See, I thought you were going to say they used an E-drum because he fired a bullet through the only bass drum in the studio. It really does sound like a car, though. It was almost indistinguishable, and it really like bleeds in nicely to that. Was it like 4 bass drums or something? Like that's insane.
Well, so here's the interesting thing. What they were able to do, because it was an E-drum kit, is that he had the rack-mounted toms set to the bass drum setting. So he's hitting a bass drum and he's hitting the 2 rack-mounted toms with sticks, and they're all giving a bass drum sound. And so that makes it sound like he's doing this crazy double bass work, but it's really him doing like a
Again, I got to ask about the live show. How did they do that?
Yeah, right? I think he probably could do it on double bass because he did have double bass drums for, that's how he played. So I'm sure he could have done it live. Maybe not quite as intense, but to be honest, I mean, it's a great beat, but everybody's listening to Eddie at that part because that is a monstrous guitar solo on the intro.
Yeah, it's wild.
Let's not bury the lead. Greatest rock and roll intro ever.
Yeah, I think it's a fair call. It's got the killer, iconic drum triple bass, right? Followed by this concerto, right? Yeah.
The way it lands into the groove.
Oh, that like it's
totally.
like Lagrange on steroids, but it seems mellow.
It's great, yeah.
It's wild. It really is wild. Like if you break it down, it feels extremely simple, but there's something about the feel, the mechanics. It's a whole vibe.
Again, take like the main rhythm part of the guitar. It swaggers in a way that I think David Lee Roth swaggers.
You're talking about like when the distortion drops out, when it goes clean.
Yeah.
Whether I'm saying that the construction of that part has a swagger to it that leads me to believe they need a guy like David Lee Roth at the helm.
Sammy Hagar couldn't have done this one, could he?
No, he could not.
I don't think he could have. That's what I'm saying. I just think he's a wholly different kind of singer, and of course that's going to take the band in a different direction, and that's fine.
Is it though?
No, it's pretty bad. I wanted to give a shout out to the Foley guy. You know, the background classroom noise that gets someone dropping a bottle. There's like a high-pitched laugh that sounds like a Fast Times at Ridgemont High guy in the background.
Yeah, like shuffling papers and stuff. Yeah.
We've talked about it on other songs, David Lee Roth's failures as a lyricist, but I think of all the education that I've missed, but then my homework was never quite
my
like
God.
this. Great line. And I would be remiss if I did not bring up that in high school, with my high school girlfriend, I don't know if you remember this, I got into a massive fight with her over whether or not the lyrics were "I've got it made" or "I've got it bad."
Yes.
And literally almost ended our relationship, mostly because I was the wrong one, and it was really hard for me to take.
That was real. It was really big of you all these years later to admit that you were wrong.
I was very clearly wrong. Oh, yes.
Wow, I just checked the lyrics now, and I was of your school of thought, Tom, and would have equally argued somebody that they were wrong, and I'm glad I never did that.
It's clear he says I've got it bad.
Correct.
But
Correct.
he pronounces it bade, which is confusing.
Yeah, logically, like in terms of syntax, that tracks. That is exactly what you would think he's saying, but he doesn't pronounce it that way. And who's really parsing his lyrics that closely?
I think I was confused about that as well at some point, for sure. Well, listen, he's the king. You were talking about the vocalizations, the nonverbal vocalizations, and he is kind of the king of the lead vocalist interstitials. I remember, it feels like it was the early days of the internet where one of those isolated vocal tracks was making the rounds. And I feel like the first one of those I ever heard was a David Lee Roth on some Van Halen track. And he's just in the booth.
It was Running with the Devil.
Yeah.
Because he has the fucking whistle ring that he blows at one point during the song.
Right.
It's amazing.
And he's just, what that brings into sharp relief is that he's alone in a vocal booth with headphones on, and yet he is making so much extra noise. It just implies a certain level of confidence that one cannot imagine having.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've all had experience having to sing vocals, and I am like deathly afraid of any errant noise. I'm like, oh God, I don't want it to jingle. I don't want to everything's got to be clean. And he's like, fuck that. I'm going to wear like a dangly necklace that clacks when I move.
It's all in my style. I was building up to say his delivery of lines like, I don't feel tardy. They're hilarious. They don't feel scripted. I don't know if they are or not. It doesn't really matter, but great.
I don't feel tardy is hilarious. It's like what? I don't even know what you're
What does that
implying.
even mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's very funny.
Yeah, but it's great.
Something I do like about David Lee Roth's voice, like we're just singing his praises. I actually kind of I like the way his voice stacks with itself. Like I think the chorus, and I mean the chorusing of him stacking his voice here sounds nice in unison. I think he has harmony choices that are consistent, and I like those too.
Isn't a lot of that coming from the bass player? Those background vocals?
It's Michael Anthony. That high background vocal, that's Michael Anthony. But then my homework.
Yeah, seriously, give him his 20%. You fucking
No,
idiot
you
bastard.
for something.
All right, okay, well, all right, it's good to know.
Okay, last song on our focus list and the last song on the album. This is the song House of Pain.
I don't know. This fell flat for me.
Yeah, what do you guys think that they were going for here? Because I kind of thought it was almost like a Motley Crue type thing, but
If I'm being kind to it, I think it's forward thinking because it sounds more like the hard charging late 80s hair metal. But it just feels like a kitchen sink. They're just throwing everything at it and not without a real idea here.
I think that this should have just been an instrumental. And I think Eddie even kind of thought that because they mixed Dave real low in this one. He is significantly quieter than the guitar. And I think it was just written with no regard for the fact that lyrics were going to have to go over at any point. He's just like, I'm just gonna throw this shit together and see what you can do with this Diamond Dave, you fucking asshole.
Tom, we really are friends because I literally wrote would have worked better as an instrumental, and I'm curious about their process and if Dave added his stuff last, which I guess is the
Yes,
case.
that is the case. This is the one that sounds like this was made for like guitar players to like. They're like, yeah, look at all this shreddy guitar. You're like, it's like a Victor Wooten album or something like that. You're like, that bass is amazing, and this is borderline unlistenable. Like, I can't get through this, but good on you. You're doing a really great job.
Yeah, it does feel like it's maybe last for a reason. It does, I think, look forward to, like you said, things like ranging from like Def Leppard to Slayer.
Sure. It's like thrash ZZ Top.
Well, I think Dokken was that the band you referenced earlier, or Rat, or one of those bands. To me,
Yes.
that this was of that ilk, and I thought it was
Sure.
a bit indistinguishable.
Tooth and nail, baby.
I mean, the chops are better, but it's just a little bit of a mess, I think.
I know we're not talking about Girl Gone Bad, but those last two could have been instrumentals, probably started off strong that way. And I think they're at the end of the record for a reason. To me, there's just a lot going on between Alex and Eddie musically, and other people are just kind of insignificant to it, I would say.
Yeah. And like, this is a short album, so there's not a whole lot of room to hide tracks. But if I was redoing the song order, I might have put I'll Wait last and buried Girl Gone Bad and House of Pain at 7 and 8. And they kept, because I feel like you need to end on something more positive. Like every time I listened through to the album and I got to this song, I was like, that's what you're going to leave me with, huh? That's the taste.
I think it could have been 9 I'll Wait.
Yes. 9 I'll Wait.
My favorite.
With Michael McDonald on vocals the entire time. Yes.
It is funny we didn't talk about I'll Wait because that was a hit for them, right? And it kind of feels like that was the darker version of the band that Eddie was hoping for, with David Lee Roth worked in. I know that Michael McDonald with the assist on the on the lyrics. Do you know what I'm saying? But there is something about this story and what we get here on this record that tells me that David Lee Roth was an important component to the band, and that his sense of fun and good time vocal stylings were important to this band being a hit. And when they went away from that, they got worse.
They got worse, but they still had a lot of hits. Like, I mean, right now, that shit was huge.
But it might as well be a different band. I'm just saying that like this incarnation of the band. So to me, that's what I'll Wait. That was an interesting example of that, where it felt like it was that darker path that Eddie was trying to get across, still incorporating David Lee Roth's thing.
And letting him have one line to be himself in I'll Wait. Such good photography. So it was proof that he could rein it in. For one song.
Exactly one song. If Michael McDonald gives him extreme notes, this is what you must do. But no, like, it's a good point that when David Lee Roth left, they became a different band. And frankly, we've talked about this with lots of artists where people stop telling you no. And David Lee Roth did make the important point to Eddie Van Halen. That's like, you're a generation level guitar player. You should probably play the fucking guitar on these Van Halen albums. And Eddie Van Halen was like, I want to play piano. And it's like, kind of anybody can play piano the way that you play piano. You need to get me some guitar. And the more that they went down that road of Sammy Hagar not being the same power pole in the band that David Lee Roth was, the more that Eddie was able to give into his indulgences in the non-guitar world and do other stuff that I think the band suffered for. I can see not wanting to feel like a one-trick pony and you just got to, the monkey pushes the button and does the thing that everybody cheers. Like, I can see not wanting to do that, but
Yeah.
Sure.
you're the best guitar player since Jimi Hendrix. You need to get more guitar out there.
To be fair, they did put out 5 records he just told us about. So I mean, they've got a fair amount of material out there. They did have to evolve at some point.
Sure.
This is the only valid version of the band in my heart.
Fair enough.
And also, I just, as a keyboard player, I want to say, imagine if he never played the synthesizer or the piano or whatever. Wow, it would be so sad to never hear Eddie Van Halen play those things. So
Fair enough. Yeah.
leave it to the Canadian to bring it back to something sentimental.
Well,
Have a
let's see
moment.
how positive you can stay as we get to our voting period and decide whether or not this really does belong on a list of 1001 albums you must hear before you die. I'm I'm putting you on the spot, going to you first.
Is this a yes or no question?
It's a yes or no question with a long explanation. That's what we normally do.
Yeah, I'm going to say yes because of Eddie Van Halen and his incredible work. It allows me to overlook some of the duds. I'm going to say yes.
All right. Alan, what do you say?
I think it's a fairly easy yes, even though I don't, again, think it's a perfect album. It's a little bit up and down. I do think there's a big difference between the wheat and the chaff on this, but the highs are incredibly high, and it does feature, one of the best musicians that we've ever had in rock. And so, yeah, it's 33 minutes. Like, you can take 33 minutes to listen to this, I think.
Fair enough. Phil, what do you say?
I am also going to give it a yes. There are definitely some things about this that are kind of begrudging, and there are definitely songs I will skip for the rest of my life. Not that I'm listening to 1984 on the regular, but yeah, there's just a little too much here, and I would tend to think that this is Eddie Van Halen's best overall record. And also, I think we've touched on some elements of how this is uniquely American, and for that reason, if you're not versed in this is definitely something different to check
How
out.
could you ever hope to stop us?
All right, Rob, what do you say?
Speaking of uniquely American, we didn't even touch on how the cover is just a baby smoking cigarettes. Yeah, it is an easy yes. I enjoyed the record. I'm a little surprised that y'all were so curmudgeonly about many of the ups and downs. To me, it is Eddie Van Halen, an instrument-defining player, not just a generational player, at his compositional best. So I think this is the most listenable Van Halen album, and I will certainly listen to it again. Absolutely listen to it.
Wait, you're surprised that we had complaints about this?
I guess I'm surprised Phil wasn't more positive on it.
I don't know. It seems like the name of the game.
Well, even though my vote is meaningless, I am still going to give it a unanimous 5 for 5 and say, yes, I have some complaints about this album, but I do think that for an artist like Van Halen, they only have 2 albums on the list. And that kind of makes sense to me. I think their debut has to be one of them because of what it was and what it did. And I think this also has to be one of them, not just because of how successful it was, because it also shows an evolution of a band, an evolution of a very important artist, and also think it had a big impact on the sound of the 80s. So there you go. Van Halen, Eddie, rest in power. Dave, take a rest from that constant philandering that I'm sure that you're doing. I like how all of the other members of the band settled down and got married and led normal lives. And David Lee Roth was like, I actually have a pack of guys that I hang out with. I forget their nickname. They have some super scumbag nickname of guys that he hangs out with. It's instead of marrying, I just made myself a sex gang that we go around. And I didn't throw this one tidbit out there, but this is the one thing that in my research I found out, which I thought was intelligent in a very creepy way. So apparently David Lee Roth had a system whereby he would give his roadies stacks of backstage passes, but he would have them put their initials on the back. And then they would go out into the crowd and hand them out to women. And if he ended up sleeping with a woman, he would check the back of her backstage pass and pay the guys whose initials were on there $100 for finding the woman to bring to him.
Like a finder's fee?
That's something else. I don't know what that is.
Something else.
It doesn't sound legal. Yes, that's... Yeah.
All right. So, M, thank you so much for coming on to the show. We really appreciate hearing from you. Great to have you on. Is there anything that you want to let our audience know? Or actually, how about this? Tell them where they can find you.
Okay. Well, first of all, you're all very lovely. And for me, it's late here. So I felt like this was like a bedtime story. mgriner.com is my website. And I also have a Patreon. I just started it this week.
Oh, fantastic.
Patreon.com mgriner. So I've put up some new songs. I'm starting that. And I also would like to add that my husband works for a publishing company that put out the Ted Templeman book.
All right.
So I should have probably read that before I jumped on it. But so yeah, he's had some great success with that. So thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Now,
Thank you.
all right, just a few things left to do before we wrap it up here. And I am going to toss it over to Rob, who has his hand in that mailbag. Rob, what do you got?
Thanks so much, Tom. But, before I get in here, I should say, did we get it right? Did we get it wrong in that vote, in that whole episode? You can tell us your opinion right now over on Patreon. We have a poll up right now. Get in there, vote on whether this Van Halen album truly was essential or not, and jump into those comments with the rest of the complainers, and all our co-hosts here will be in there as well. Let us know what you think. But another way to let us know what you think is our mailbag, and I'm going to read a couple missives today. First up, we have Dan from England who writes, "Hi guys, love the show, though I rarely get as far as the bit where you get to read out the mail, as I'm often in bed when listening, and I'm getting to the stage in life when you fall asleep whenever you sit down to watch or listen to something you enjoy. I'm embracing it even if my wife isn't. Anyway, I just finished the Ryan Adams Heartbreaker episode, and I loved it. I felt similarly conflicted. What a prick, eh? I love this album, but I haven't listened to it for over 10 years, and I was struck by how much I didn't like aspects of it when listening again. Touched with brilliance, but so many flaws. Also wanted to say your Folsom Prison episode made me piss myself laughing, though it did take me 3 attempts to finish it, as a lot of it was listened to in my sleep subconscious, but totally worth the effort."
I think the pissing yourself is an age thing, too. Just throwing it out there. Prostate's giving out on you.
It's the prison set, man. That got a lot of traction.
He closes by saying, "Keep it up even if sleepy farts in their 40s can't stay awake. Don't take it personally." Well, I think we all understand what you're talking about there, my friend.
Oh, yeah.
We have one more here. Paul from Liverpool writes, "Hi, guys. After discovering you, after you were mentioned on the Three Bean Salad podcast, I've been working my way through your back catalog. Thank you for helping me get some value from my Spotify subscription these past 8 months. I've listened to or endured every album prior to each show, with the exception of Napalm Death. After getting through the first couple songs, in quotes, I realized that I begrudged them receiving my fraction of a cent for my streams. Kudos to you all for listening to it multiple times and for remaining on brand by including Steely Dan references in the episode." Anyway, I was writing to tell you that in one of your recent episodes, Tom mentioned that his wife had been at a Hanson gig, and I was disappointed that you didn't mention that they have their own beer. It's called, can you guess?
I know what it's called. The Hops.
It's called Hops. Anyway, keep up the great work.
Have you actually had that, or did you just...
I've actually had that.
I was going to say, that's a great poll if you just came up with that.
Thank you for writing, everybody. We read every email that comes to us about any old thing, whether we got it right, whether we got it wrong, your opinions, context, and telling us about the beer brands that artists that some of us possibly guiltily enjoy have produced and put out into the world. So keep those emails coming over to 1001albumcomplaints@gmail.com.
All right. Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you to everyone who wrote in. And thank you to everyone who has listened all the way to the end of the episode where we get our homework assignment for next week. I have the Albinator here. It's been doing splits in the corner and giving the eye to every woman that walks by. I'm going to see if I can get its attention and have it spit out an album. Without any further ado, drum roll, please. We will be listening to... The album is Nilsson Schmilsson, and the artist is Harry Nilsson. This is a great one. Is this the one where he's on his robe on the cover? Like he's like in a robe and he looks like...
I feel like he might have more than one like that, but yes, yeah, it is that one, yeah.
He just seems like a wreck of a human being on his album covers.
I think he was a prolific drinker for sure.
We referenced this when I made fun of the Wilco Schmilko album.
Right. The Albinator knows all and sees all.
Wasn't he also stated as Paul McCartney's favorite singer for a period of time? Harry Nilsson.
Listen, man, don't cannibalize all next week's material.
Don't cannibalize the content. I get it. Sorry, Rob. Well, there you have it. Listen to Nilsson Schmilsson for next week. And until then, for everyone here at 1001 Album Complaints, I have been Tom.
I'm Alan.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Rob.
A boo 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 boosh. might as well boosh. Boosh.